Good afternoon. I'm Susan Carvalho, Associate Provost and Dean of the Graduate School, and it is my honor to get to work with the Burnum Award Selection Committee. And I'm delighted to welcome you here and to give a little bit of background. Dr. John Burnum and his wife Celeste established this award in 1979, and they purposefully included a public lecture as part of the award celebration. First, so that the Burnum Award winner would have an opportunity to shine and be a role model for other faculty. But they also did it so that they personally could get an up-close look at the world-class research being done at UA. They were intellectuals and they were lifelong learners, and it's a privilege to sustain their legacy here today. And I'm very glad to welcome Celeste and John's daughter, Leslie, here, and her husband, Jim, attending the lecture. Before I say more, I was asked to issue a reminder that the University Club reception to follow begins at 6 p.m., and it will not begin earlier than 6 p.m., so the doors will not open early, so please be respectful of that. The Burnum awardee is selected each year from the most competitive pool of faculty you can imagine in vastly different disciplines. So for the committee to identify the highest impact scholar is no small task. The committee is made up exclusively of past Burnum winners, so they are very much up to the task. And on behalf of the committee, whom I'd like to thank for their hard work and their insight, it's my pleasure to congratulate Dr. Heather Cass-White as the 46th winner of the Burnum Distinguished Faculty Award. And to honor the department and the space we're in, I'll just say that the English department was last represented in the Burnum Pantheon in 2012 when Joel Brower won the award. Is Joel here? And other names that I know still echo in the halls are Robin Bain, Philip Beadler, George Wolfe, and Fred Hobson. So every decade, the English department has been recognized for its outstanding impact. And I was reminded today that the winner of another of UA's top faculty awards, Blackman Moody Outstanding Professor Award, is also from the Department of English, Dr. Albert Pianchi. So congratulations to all of the faculty, staff, and students who make this such a rich environment for the profession's top scholars. No further ado, to tell us why Dr. White was the clear winner this year, I'm glad to turn the microphone over to Dr. David Deutsch, former Chair of English and current Associate Provost for Faculty Affairs. David.
Hey everyone, it is good to see all of you, and it is good to be home in the English department and to see so many familiar faces here. So thank you, Susan, and thank you to Professor Lauren Cardin for shepherding the nomination along. Now, I'm beyond thrilled to introduce tonight Professor Heather White as UA honors her with the Burnum Award. Professor White has been a faculty member now at UA for 2.5 decades, so many of you will know her quite well. But I want to introduce her in a somewhat different light. For Heather is a literary scholar, and a very good one, but she is also a particular kind of literary scholar. Heather is a literary archaeologist and a literary architect all at once. She's a digger, an excavator, a cultivator of rare artifacts, facts and thoughts and details from letters, from manuscripts, from the rare, one-of-a-kind, obscure papers you can sometimes see spread across her office floor if you visit her. And she brings these rare artifacts up and out into the light so that we can use them to improve ourselves and our society, the two at once. And as she does so, sorting through artifacts and archives and old editions, Heather dusts them off and breathes life into them by putting them into a proper framework, a sort of substructure, a foundation. This is important, I can tell you, because a good archaeologist, from the Greek archaeos meaning old and logos meaning speech or reason, and this term archaeology has wide use, as engineers and architects and biologists who have invented the beautiful word archaeogenetics can confirm. Well, a good archaeologist is necessary for building a good foundation for the future. We need to know the past to know where we are going, to navigate where we are, and to keep building successfully into the future. Indeed, Heather's work, including most notably her 3 editions of Marianne Moore's work, which carefully excavate a major poetic lineage, has helped to provide an appropriate foundation and even scaffolding for other scholars working today, for scholars of all ranks. As one senior scholar noted, putting an edition together, to say nothing of 3, is an incredibly hard, often thankless task. It's not showy, it's not done to turn heads or to show off or to look modish. It is a painstaking, complex work that is done to make the intellectual lives of readers better. And in this sense, putting together an edition, years in the making, is an immense kind of public service, which is one everyone should value. Its public value has been noted, and very publicly so. A younger French professor remarked of Professor White, "If her literary erudition and powers of analysis make her one of the finest scholars I have ever read, I also rank her among the most generous, benevolent, and encouraging colleagues I have known." Generosity and literary erudition, this isn't easy and it's risky. A senior scholar doesn't want to shape or to embellish someone else's work too much when advising, but we want to share enough so that younger scholars can build on us to invent for themselves. Indeed, equally touching for those of us teachers is to help younger scholars make their own mark in the world. Heather herself might not know this, but a look through ProQuest, the International Dissertation Depository, indicates how much of her research has influenced the intellectual lives of graduate students in and outside of UA. From UGA, NYU, Loyola Chicago, and Princeton, and I can go on. And I'm sure Princeton faculty are fine, but it doesn't surprise me, and it won't surprise you, that for the fine details, Princeton graduate students turn to the tide. Indeed, younger scholars from across the globe are building new rooms of knowledge based on Professor White's foundational work. Of course, as we all know, the best scholars don't live in isolation, and UA is thankfully not an ivory tower. It's not a fortress set apart, and rather UA and its best scholars are enmeshed in and working for the breathing, pulsating cultural and professional lives of our state and nation. As evidence of this, I want to tell you of a particularly thrilling moment when I was doing research in Chicago, and it was cold, dreary, and the world didn't seem quite right. And as I walked past a bookstore in a hipsterish professional part of town, which is usually where I hang out with the hipsters, under the brown fog of a winter afternoon, a crowd flowed past, looking in the window, and there myself and many others saw Professor White's most recent edition of Marianne Moore's poetry in the store window. The book was influencing not just scholars, but the programmers, physicians, lawyers, and all the people who turned to books to inspire and enliven their professional lives, to expand their imagination. This is what we want from our scholars, works for the world in all its varieties. Professor White produces scholarship for wide-reading, multifaceted, and indeed promiscuous readers. Discussing reading and Elizabeth Bishop's work in her own recent book, Books Promiscuously Read, Heather notes that often in poetry, the most important work gets done off stage, behind our own backs, somewhere sequestered from our direct attention and pursuit for our own protection. Some part of this strikes me as internally and particularly true, and we need to bring it into the light. Students being trained to read widely, variedly, being introduced by our faculty to books and ideas. It doesn't matter whether we agree with them or they have been outdated or are too ahead of their time, but being introduced to new ideas from unexpectedly intricate minds is the most important work being done off stage. Someone may build a better stage or space station or business, and we'll do all that. We'll use language to engage the world around them. Literature and Heather's work helps people to navigate what Heather herself had called, referring to Walt Whitman, the uneasy territory between self and other, between civic and imaginative life. Now, somewhere between digging the foundation in the castle or ivory tower lies the cottage, so often associated in literature with using the imagination to navigate through civic life. Elizabeth Bishop, discussing Walt Whitman and Ginsberg, two poets who both at times literally worked for the state. Whether that was for the state's own good or not is up for debate, but I don't think we would have wanted Ginsberg working too much for the state, but nonetheless, wrote lines such as, How stupidly we steered into the night was past and never found out where the cottage was. But Bishop keeps the cottage goal in mind, and Ginsberg renovating his strange new cottage in Berkeley, and notably Henry David Thoreau's cabin or cottage on Walden Pond, has quite explicitly influenced the new trend in building industry, the tiny house, regardless of what you think of the tiny house. The point about the cottage, though, I think, is that it's an incubator for big ideas. And so in a very real way, the literary cottage industry, on a grand scale, on a tidal wave scale, describes what we do here, and indeed what Heather has built and shared with and for Alabama and for the nation. She's moved past establishing a foundation and moved towards a working cottage industry of a useful intellectualism. And her training of students, as their letters for her Burnham package so eloquently indicate, evidence how her students have used the poetic thinking from her courses to inspire their own imaginative lives, and then spiraling out to inspire their work in the world. They have used poetic thinking to hone and to give a narrative purpose to their technical skills. This is one way among so many that the humanities matter, and that the humanities at UA matter. They give professionals imagination to move towards a better personal and civic life, even as messy as that journey can sometimes be. As Heather has written, the transgressions inherent in reading do not follow easy or orderly ethical dividing lines. And learning to read, to really read and think, helps leaders to chart those uneasy paths, to enable a workforce to explain why they are working and how their training in whatever disciplines propels us forward to live better lives as writers, lawyers, doctors, engineers, business leaders, name your profession, who can articulate why they do what they do and how it makes for a better, a more poetic society. Tonight we are here to celebrate one of these big achievements, a literary archaeologist and architect, a literary excavator and architect, a literature professor who has drawn up the plans of her poet and her field and shared the greater warmth of that building for the benefit of her students, for their personal lives, and for our lives. And in this way, the ripple begets the tidal wave for the benefit of our students and the benefit for all of us. So while this has started as a way of celebrating Heather, I want to end by thanking her on behalf of her students and on behalf of all of us.
That was not helpful. My talk is not as good as David's introduction. Thank you, David. David kept referring to the cottage, which he knows perfectly well is a heated rivalry reference. And if he thinks I'm not going to call that out, I'm going to start with some thank yous. They're the most important things I'll say, and I'm so scared I'm going to forget someone. So if I start with them, then I can sort of subconsciously think about it during the talk and think of anybody I missed. I want to start with the Burnham family, President Moeller, and the Burnham Committee. I've been on enough prize committees, grant committees, job search committees to know that it's really awful work, and that saying yes to any one person means saying no to at least one and often more than one equally deserving people. So thank you for letting it be me tonight, and I'm ready to hand that baton over to the next person more or less the minute I'm stopping or I'm finished speaking. I want to thank the UA English Department. This has been my intellectual home for 26 years, and nobody could have asked for a better one. I have things in detail to say about it, but in general, it is filled with extraordinary people, researchers, writers, scholars, artists. You couldn't ask for a better home. I want to thank the people that hired me, Sally Davis, Joe Hornsby, and Michael Martone. I guess more than just them hired me, but they were my interview committee. I thank them. Everything good in my life after that moment has flowed from that decision, so way to go. I have friends and family here tonight who have traveled great distances. I have people from New Mexico, Florida, and Georgia. People came in from Birmingham and Mobile and Gadsden, and I could not be more touched. My original family is here, my parents, Stuart and Liza White, and my sister, Kelly White. My sister's husband, Mel, couldn't be here tonight, but I'm thinking of him, and I know he's thinking of me. And then I have my current family, my husband, Randy, our boys, Zeke and Xander, and my daughter, Ingrid, who could not be here tonight, but whom I'm thinking about every minute of every day, today as on every day. And then I just want to thank everyone who is here. My husband can tell you what it takes to get me out of my house on any night, let alone a rainy night. So if you're here, please believe I could not be more grateful. So when I first talked to Susan Carvalho about the talk, she said the idea was to give people a sense of what brought me here, what it is that I do, and how did I get to this point. So I've called my road here, Learning to Read, a love story with 2 career mistakes. The mistakes, I mean, I'm happy I made them. They were good mistakes to make, but they made things a little harder on me than maybe I needed to do. But learning to read, that's where it all started for me, so here we are at the beginning. The slide says 1970. This picture is actually, I think, from 1971. I was born in 1970. I was a kid who loved to read. It was the thing that everybody said about me. It was certainly the thing I said about myself, but when I think about it, that doesn't really seem quite strong or deep enough for what reading was to me. I would say I had something like a reading disorder. When other people were learning how to be social, how to handle their own emotions, how to, become a human being, I was reading. I love this picture for a lot of reasons, but one of them is that I wrote this book about reading that David mentioned, and I'll talk about that a little later, but if I just had to come up with one image that embodies how I think we ought to read, I would say stark naked and with your brokenness front and center. That'll do really well. At some point, pretty early, I made the first career mistake of my life, which was I got interested in poetry. If you want to narrow your job prospects, the job prospects for any English PhD are not great, but if you really want to narrow them right down, I suggest you specialize in poetry. If you want to drive students away from your courses, make sure that they frequently don't put poetry in the title. And if you want to just basically embarrass people at cocktail parties, when they ask what you do, say that you specialize in poetry. And then they say, hopefully, oh, are you a poet? And you say, no, I just read it. So it was a mistake. I'm happy I made it, but I can tell you the very moment that it started. It was in 1987. I was a senior in high school at Calabasas High. I was in an AP English class taught by Eileen Tunick. Shout out, she was the greatest. She introduced us to the poet Emily Dickinson. A lot of people in the audience will know plenty about Dickinson, but just briefly, she was born in the 1830s. She wrote most of her major work in the Civil War period, 1861 to 1865. And by the time she died, none of her poems, maybe technically one, but basically none of the 2,000 poems she wrote had ever been published. So we were just left with a big box of manuscripts. So Eileen Tunick taught me this poem, and I'll read it to you. This is my letter to the world that never wrote to me, the simple news that nature told with tender majesty. Her message is committed to hands I cannot see. For love of her, sweet countrymen, judge tenderly of me. Now, the moment that really got me, the thing that started this whole thing was this second to the last line. For love of her, sweet countrymen. What I loved, and what my teacher helped me to see, was that there's a fundamental ambiguity in that line. The ambiguity is, what noun does the adjective sweet modify? Is the poet saying, for love of her, nature, who is sweet? Or is she saying, for love of her, nature, and then saying, sweet countrymen? The punctuation is not going to tell you. It's just a bunch of dashes. Sweet is suspended there like, a bubble in a spirit level. And there's nothing to tell you. And once I realized that there was no teacher's guide to this poem, there was no answer key, there was nobody who could tell me how to read this poem, I just lost my mind. I went nuts. It was just something that I could think about for as long as I wanted, and that just seemed magic. What I did not know at the time, what took me a long time to learn, was that I wasn't just being introduced to something fundamental about poetry here. I was being introduced to the power of an editor. So before I go into that anymore, on this slide, you can see that the poem doesn't have a title, it has a number. Dickinson did not title her poems. So the only way that we collectively have kept track of them is that an editor assigned numbers to every single one. So now we talk about either Dickinson's poem, This Is My Letter to the World, or just Dickinson's poem, 441. In the bottom left-hand corner, you can see circa 1862. That means that's our best guess about when she wrote it. She didn't title poems, and she didn't date them either, so we don't really know. And then in the bottom right-hand corner, 1890 is when the poem was first published. This is well after her death. People gathered her poems, set them into print, and published them as a book. Now, I want to show you something about that 1890 version. If you can't read this, if it's not big enough, that's okay. All I really want you to see in this slide is that in the 1890 edition of Dickinson's poetry, the poem that I loved is not actually treated as a separate poem at all. It's over here on the left-hand side, set into italic type, and it's been used as an epigraph to the whole volume. So the actual poems start over here on the right, and they're numbered 1, 2, 3. So this is not anything that Dickinson wanted. This is not what she intended. This is just what her editors decided to do. And here, I hope you can read this, is a comparison of the poem I liked in its 1890 version and the version I read in 1987. There are sort of two salient things I hope you can see right away. One is that the 1987 version has idiosyncratic capitalization. So the letters world, me, news, nature, majesty, message, hands, her, sweet, and me are all capitalized. Over in the 1890 version, the editors got rid of all that, and they capitalized, as is standard for poetry, with a capital letter at the beginning of every line only. The other thing, and the more important in my mind, is that this poem that I read in 1987 has no conventional punctuation marks. The 1890 version is punctuated conventionally. So in 1987, I read a poem that only had a bunch of dashes, and in 1890, everybody read a poem that had commas and a period and a semicolon and even a little jaunty exclamation point at the end. Maybe you can see immediately that one effect of that is that it completely erases the ambiguity that caught me in the first place. So everybody in 1890 read that second to the last line, for love of her, comma, sweet countrymen, comma, judge tenderly of me. There's no ambiguity at all. So, I mean, I don't know what would have happened if that's the version I read. That was sort of the domino that started the whole chain. And what I loved in it simply isn't there in that version. That 1890 version persisted until I think about 1951, when all of her work was re-edited. Now here is the manuscript that every editor of Dickinson works from. I don't know about you. Before I started thinking about this stuff, I kind of had an idea that poems, and maybe even literature in general, just like existed out there in some ideal form, so that if you wanted to reprint a poem, you just consulted, I don't even know what I thought, like, the tablet of carved marble or something where the real poem existed. It's not like that at all. poems only exist in the material versions, the actual paper on which somebody wrote them or typed them. So here, for example, is the only original, the base text for Dickinson's poem. Maybe the first thing you can see is that it's hard to read. Her handwriting started awful and it got impenetrable. So just reading Dickinson manuscripts is a skill all by itself. I don't know how well you can see, but, well, you can't because you can't read Dickinson's handwriting. If you could read Dickinson's handwriting, you will see that she actually capitalizes in a non-standard way, so that the poem I read was following her lead in capitalizing all those letters. There is also no standard punctuation here. There are these little marks that an editor interpreted as dashes and punctuated the poem in its printed version. I learned a lot about this stuff in graduate school. I got really interested. Once it sort of got through to me that poems didn't get transmitted through some like perfect process of telepathy, like somebody had to sit down and type them out and look at them. Like once I got that, the implications just sort of never stopped for me. But it really got going. Oops, yeah. Forgive me. It really got going when I discovered another poet who needed editing, and I made mistake number 2. There we go. I became a scholarly editor. If there is a less sexy descriptor than scholarly editor, I have never heard it. This is like, it's really, I would never say this to somebody I had just met. I would never use this phrase in the company of somebody who wasn't a professional, because asking them to like carry that conversational burden would just be awful. But I did, and I mean, I think it's fascinating, and sort of one thing I want to show you is why I keep doing it. The most immediate reason was that I got interested in this poet, Marianne Moore. David talked at delightful length about my editions of Marianne Moore. She lived from 1887 to 1972. She lived most of that time in New York and Brooklyn. She was really important in what we call the modernist period, which is roughly the period between the 2 world wars, sort of closer to the first one. The cohort of her peers included T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, Wallace Stevens, William Carlos Williams, Robert Frost. She never became a household name the way some of those poets did, but maybe you'll just take my word for it that if you're interested in this period and poetry, you're interested in her. It turned out that her body of work had a lot of problems. And jumping ahead, about 20 years after I first learned about her, I did my best to fix those problems in this book. So in 2017, I published the new collected poems of Marianne Moore that put everything in shape. Now, I both need a drink of water, and I'm realizing that I've forgotten what my next slide is. So we're all going to be surprised by where I go next. Oh, excellent. I want to tell you a story about scholarly editing and what a burden it is to one's family when you are a scholarly editor. The story centers on my son Zeke, who's over there on the left. But I realized I couldn't show you a picture of Zeke without showing you a picture of his twin brother Xander. So there they are. I made the purple pants Zeke is wearing. He wanted to look like Steve from Minecraft, so I did that. But then I thought, I can't show you my children as they were without showing you my children as they are. So there's Zeke still on the left, Xander on the right, and my daughter Ingrid in the middle. This is Christmas time in Albuquerque. They're getting ready to make dinner for all of us. But when I put this slide into my show, I thought, I really need to talk about the one time in my career that I encountered any friction or really any obstacle of any kind. And it was in 2003 when I got pregnant with my daughter Ingrid. And at the time, I was not tenured. I'd only been here 3 years. It was another 3 before I went up for tenure. So I went to the dean's office, and I should say, by the way, No one involved in this story is still at UA. This is a whole different set of people. So I went to the dean's office to find out what the maternity leave policy for faculty was. And I was told that there was no policy, that the dean just basically said, you get a leave or you don't get a leave. So I asked about slowing the tenure clock during maternity leave, which I had heard happened at other universities, and I was told no, they had never heard of such a thing, UA never did that, and they weren't about to start now. Back in my department, either when I announced that I was pregnant or maybe when I just started to look pregnant, I don't really remember, 3 of my senior colleagues let it be known that getting pregnant before tenure was a sure sign that I was not serious about my career. And one of those people just stopped talking to me altogether. At the time, I had a male colleague about my age, also not tenured, and when he announced that his wife was pregnant, those same 3 people said, congratulations. Now, I'm telling this story not because it was such a horrible crime against me. I didn't really like those colleagues anyway. I thought they were a bunch of jerks, so, you know. They were welcome to have their opinion. And I did get a leave, and I got tenure. So, you know, everything worked out pretty great for me. But I'm telling this story against a particular backdrop, which is this. This is a story that probably a lot of people in the audience have heard about, but in case you haven't, I will tell you. There were 2 student-run led magazines. One was called 1956, and it focused on black students on campus, issues of interest to black students, and the other was Alice, which was, again, student-run, student-led, and it focused on issues of interest to women on the UA campus. 1956 had been in business for 5 years, and Alice had existed for 10. Neither of these magazines violated any policy. There had been no complaints about them. There had been no problems. And in fact, they had provided a venue for generations of students to write, to learn about publishing, to learn about editing, and so forth. In December of 2025, the university shut them both down with no warning. Suddenly, they just weren't allowed to exist anymore. Now, as best I've been able to piece it together, because nobody told us anything about this, nobody even announced this, it just happened. As best I can piece it together, the university made that decision in response to then Attorney General Pam Bondi's memo that had a list of non-binding recommendations for universities complying with the president's anti-DEI policies. For my money, the 2 words that stand out there are non-binding and recommendations. I mean, I don't know what to say about this. I don't know who made that decision. I don't know what message they intended to send with it. But I can tell you for sure that the message we all received was that if we are black, or if we are female, or if, God forbid, we're both of those at once, we're certainly allowed to be those things, but we are not allowed to talk about them. If we want to discuss them, we need to go elsewhere than the university. Not only are we not supposed to do it at the university, but the university is going to shut us down before anybody has compelled them to do so. I don't feel great about this. I can tell you it's engendered a good bit of fear on campus, fear in students, fear in graduate students, certainly fear among faculty without tenure protections, untenured faculty, renewable contract faculty, you name it, everybody got this message loud and clear. If we don't like what you have to say, we will shut you down and we don't have to explain ourselves. So that's why I'm up here telling you my story about being a woman, cat's out of the bag. I'm female as well as a professor, and the effect it had on me at UA. But it all started in a much happier place, which was this slide with pictures of my children. And I do want to say, like, giving the devil his due, that those colleagues who said I wasn't serious about my career because I got pregnant before tenure, they were actually kind of right, because once my children was born, nothing seemed important or serious to me anymore. Certainly not on that scale. Nothing even came close. And I really wanted to tell this cute story about Zeke, so I'm going to get back to that. So one thing you need to know about Zeke is that particularly when he was little, he was my #1 PR guy. Like, if I did it, Zeke was going to tell you about it. So Zeke and Xander were about 9 in 2017. When I published my book, the publisher sent me, a big box of the books, and I put them in the middle of our breakfast room table. And when Zeke came home from school one day, he had a friend, I think his friend was Charlie, actually, who was going to spend the night. And so Zeke grabbed Charlie by the hand, drug him over to the table, pointed, and said, look, my mom edited a book. And Charlie wrinkled up his face and quite sensibly said, what does edited mean? And the other thing to know about Zeke is that he's never backed down from a challenge in his life. He does not stop. So he gathered his wits and he fired right back. He said, it means my mom made sure there were no mistakes in spelling or grammar. So thank you, darling, for defending my honor, and you were not wrong. I did actually work pretty hard to make sure there were no mistakes in spelling or grammar. But I did a bunch of other stuff, too. I would love to talk to you. I mean, I could genuinely talk for hours about what I did, but I just want to talk about one particular thing I did and show you, like, it's what keeps me going, essentially. So when I was writing my dissertation, I wrote a chapter on Marianne Moore, and as you do, I read all the criticism I could find on Marianne Moore's work, and once or twice, I read critics writing about a poem called Half Deity. This baffled me because I knew I had read Marianne Moore inside and out, and I had never heard of a poem called Half Deity. So, because I was at a great research university, I went to the rare book room, I looked around, and I found a first edition copy of the book in which she published the poem, and this is a scan from that book. It's illustrated. You can see it's a poem about a butterfly. Moore calls the butterfly half deity, half worm, which I thought was pretty great. So I found the poem, and I loved it. And I thought, this is not a minor poem. This is a great poem. I happen to know it was written during the time when she was writing her most important work. And I thought, it is crazy that you have to have immediate access to a world-class rare book room to see this poem. Like, why on earth is that so? Well, it turns out there were very good reasons for that being so. The book that I was reading at the time, The Complete Poems of Marianne Moore, was also the book that everybody in the field was reading at the time. It's very misleading. If what you want is the complete poems of Marianne Moore, you should never go to that book called The Complete Poems of Marianne. It had 3 chief problems. One was that it was edited by Moore herself, by the way, so this is how she wanted things. It omits nearly half of her published poems. They're just not in there. It presents her work out of chronological order so that there's no way to trace her development as a poet. You have no idea when she wrote any given poem based on its position in the book. And sort of worst of all, in my way of thinking, it prints shorter, revised versions of many of her best poems. So just to take one example, a favorite poem of mine by Moore is The Frigate Pelican. When she published it in 1934, it had 12 stanzas, and the version in this book has 5. So a lot of Marianne Moore was not collected in the complete poems of Marianne Moore. I thought that was a problem. One of the things I did in my edition was I restored all of those poems that she cut. I was very pleased in particular to put Half Deity back in. One set of lines that I want to show you from Half Deity are these. It's actually about a girl chasing a butterfly through a garden. So the poet says of that girl, she, with controlled, agitated glance, observes the insect's face and all's a quiver with significance. Xander is making faces at me. He knows where this is going. I love that phrase, a quiver with significance. I just love the idea of sort of an electrically charged atmosphere that you couldn't sort of say why everything mattered, and yet it did. I like that phrase so much that in 2008, when I published my first edition of her work, this was a much smaller edition, I called it A Quiver with Significance, Marianne Moore, 1932 to 1936. last year, a poet named Robin Schiff. Robin Schiff teaches at the University of Chicago. She is a wonderful poet. Everybody should run out and read her. She published a book called Information Desk. I was super excited about this. A lot of people were excited about it, and it was every bit as good as I'd hoped, as a lot of people who weren't me also noticed. It was a finalist for the Pulitzer in 2025, and speaking of like prizes where there's more than one deserving winner, I'm still just hopping mad it didn't win. It should have. But what I want to show you are a few lines from a poem it contains called To the Cuckoo Paper Wasp. It's about a wasp that acts as a cuckoo to paper wasps, in that it removes paper wasp larvae from their cells and it stuffs its own larvae in. So the poet is describing this, and she says this: each forthcoming life a secret froth, brimming its neat wasp paper cell, the weirdest cupcake batter, a quiver in thin paper liners. Anybody notice anything? There's that word. I can't tell you. I mean, I'm reading along, I get to that word, and I think I know in my bones where she found that word. I know exactly what she is thinking of. Very thrilling. And then I actually met Robin last fall. And so we got to talking about stuff, and I brought up the issue of that word, a quiver. And she said not only was it absolutely a reference to half deity, but it was her specific encoded thank you to me personally, because my edition was where she had first encountered the poem. So I don't even know what to say. American poetry itself is now different in this tiny, tiny, tiny little way. Because I sort of formed a living bridge between a past poet and a present one. And I don't think I'm ever going to do anything that makes me happier than that. Oh, now I've forgotten what's next. Wait. Oh, that's right. So after I published my book in 2017, the edition of Moore, I was exhausted. I was tired of Moore. I was tired of editing. I never in my life wanted to pore over a tiny little document again. And I decided that what it was time to do was talk about reading itself, this practice that has shaped every facet of my life at every age I've ever been since I've been able to do it. So I did. I wrote this book, Books Promiscuously Read, Reading as a Way of Life, and I want to read you just 3 very short passages from it. The first chapter is called Propositions. I just lay out a series of ideas that the reader can sort of play with or agree with or disagree or whatever. So the first proposition, the one I'll read here, is called Readers Should Read. Reading is one portal among many to rich inner experience. It is one mode among many of living the life that one has, astonishingly and against all odds, been given. Not everyone has to be a reader. However, if reading is a possibility felt to be open to any extent, then it is good to do it every day with one's whole attention, while also asking nothing in particular of it or of oneself while doing it. Reading in this way is doing something, not failing to do something else. It can be surprisingly hard to hold on to this truth, however powerfully we experience it. In most ways, my life as a reader and my life as an English teacher go hand in glove. They are inseparable. But there's also a funny tension, and so this is the place where I talk about that tension a little bit. The point of reading is to do work, to do play, that is so intimate, so foundational to the soul's development that it becomes difficult to describe, let alone design a curriculum around. We can make guesses about books that will be important to students. We can lead them to the books that have mattered to others, and we can help them develop habits of concentration, investigation, and reflection, but so much can go wrong in the process. So much is practically guaranteed to go wrong when education, a system in which engagement is mandatory, meets reading, a practice that is voluntary or it is nothing. How many readers are lost every day because they learn that reading means performing one's mastery on a test rather than losing oneself altogether? I don't know the answer to that question. So I reach a number of conclusions in the book, but this, I think, is the last one, so I'll just read this. If we need an avatar of a reader's joy, we might bear in mind a 12-year-old girl. Her reading habits reward study and emulation. How does she read? She reads a lot, for one thing, often when other people would prefer she didn't. At the dinner table is a good time, or at lunchtime at school, surrounded by friends. Bedtime is a given, but the beach works fine too, as do family gatherings of all kinds. Rereading is so instinctively pleasurable that she is several years away from noticing that adults rarely seem to do it. She is years away from understanding that not everyone hoards books or feels relieved to be left alone with them. She is a literary omnivore, reading, since reading is a matter of life or death, self or no self, the way wild animals eat. She is innocent. She is an amateur in a world run by professionals. I work with graduate students a lot on publication. Publication is the great, it's the great fear and hope of every graduate student. It was for me, it is for graduate students always. And the anxiety around it tends to have two nodes. One of them is, how in the world will I ever get anybody to publish me? And the other is, when I get published, then everybody will be able to see my work, and they're not going to like it, and there's going to be nothing I can do about that. And what I'm here to say to any grad students who might be here tonight is that if you just keep working at it, you're definitely going to get published. No problem. It'll take care of itself. But on the other hand, it's true. People are absolutely not going to like what you do. Ask me how I know. Here is a Goodreads 1-star review of my book. It's right up there in public. Anybody can look it up. This reader said, overall, the book is far too academic and cerebral for my taste, though to its credit, it is mercifully short. I know. It's not only like a bad review, it is sort of word for word specifically my fears about this book. It is exactly what I was worried people would say. So that wasn't so great. But some people liked it. So here's a good star's 5-star review of my book. This reader says, this book is dope. The author's mind when it comes to reading is turned all the way on. The way she links various concepts to the love of reading and just gets so deep in it, you feel like you're floating in space. Anyway, Homegirl was on one, and I really enjoyed her thoughts. I mean, what I have to say is, Homegirl, I enjoy your thoughts. Thank you so much for putting that up there in public where everybody can see it. I think, God, I've forgotten my slide again. I'm more nervous than I thought. I think where this is going is that it's time for me to talk about teaching. I was thinking about the vulnerability of publishing, where you absolutely do put yourself where everybody can see you and have any opinion they want and say anything they want. And that made me think about the vulnerability of the classroom. This is an award largely about teaching, and I had so much time to think about teaching. I've been thinking about it for almost 30 years now. And I still had nothing, I still have nothing like pithy to say, really. But since mild trauma dumping seems to be a theme for tonight, I thought I would share with you the worst student review I ever got. So here is a no stars student review. I'll just read it out loud for you. Heather White is the worst professor and the worst person I have ever met. I mean, I haven't read my student evaluations for this particular semester, so there's still time for something to go wrong. I don't think anything's ever going to be worse than that. I bring it up just because I think at least one thing it shows, well, I should say, like, that's not typical. My reviews don't usually sound like that. Like, don't lose faith in the Burnham committee. They did their due diligence. But I mean, at least one thing it does show is how vulnerable students really are in the classroom. They have to listen to us. They have to repeat what we say. They have to show us their work and then accept our judgment. And the more they like us and the more they like the subject, the more they care about our judgment. And it's a very delicate and living thing that happens in the classroom. And when a teacher misses a student in some crucial way, as I obviously did here, it is very painful. And it's painful for the teacher too. I think I speak for every teacher in this room when I say, I'm never gonna forget this. I'm never gonna forget negative reviews that weren't even close to this bad, you know? They all live somewhere in my brain. But thinking about teaching, I did think about what it gives me. You can ask my students, some of whom are here tonight, what it does for them. But when I think about what it gives me, I thought back to the word amateur, which came up at the end of my book, The Reader is an Amateur Among Professionals. When you start doing a job, anybody who has done a job in this room knows, like, becoming a professional is no great trick. And before you know it, you're a professional. What's difficult is remaining an amateur. We say amateur when we mean unskilled, bad at something. It's always a bad thing to call somebody an amateur. But the roots, of course, are not so scary. So French and amateur is simply someone who loves. The classical Latin from which the French is derived means lover, devoted friend, enthusiastic admirer. So when I think about what teaching gives me, it is this. It keeps me in touch with my amateur status. It reminds me of the openness and the softness and the vulnerability that you have to bring to what you do if it's going to do anything for you or anybody else at all. And that's what my students bring me. And they do that because they trust me with their own vulnerability and openness and beginning. So I'm going to leave you with this image of me doing my best to infect the most vulnerable people in my orbit with my own obsessions. You can ask them how it went, but I had a great time trying, and I thank you so much for letting me talk to you about it tonight. Thank you. Yeah, it's a good question. I don't personally know that. So the question is, the Dickinson poem was marked circa 1862. How do we know that if she didn't date them? The answer is that there are people who do nothing all day but think about things like Dickinson's handwriting in any given year, or the kind of paper she was using that day or that week or that month. There's a whole bunch of context clues that people look at to make decisions like that, but they can never be absolutely sure, which is why they say circa, which is just a way of saying we kind of think, but we're not sure. Oh my God, Zeke Fowler-White. Is this a question or a roast, sweetheart? I'm sorry, I don't actually understand the question, so I'm going to try and repeat it, and then you can tell me what I'm missing. Is the question, how do I decide what's important enough to work with, to edit? Oh. I'm 56 years old. I mean, my heart can't take anything more exciting than scholarly editing. It's a really good question. There's a certain irony in the fact that I became a scholarly editor, because like what that means is that like I live or die on the difference between a punctuation mark or a variant spelling or a misprint. And I don't think of myself as somebody who's very good with detail, actually. Here's another teaching story. Anyway. So I was giving a midterm, and I walked into the classroom, and I handed out everybody's midterm, and they got going, and then I could see them sort of darting glances at one another, and I said, "What's up?" And it turned out that I had printed out a midterm, but I had printed out a double-sided document on single-sided paper, so they simply didn't have half of their midterm. That's the level of detail that I am capable of missing. The question is, like, how do I keep going? Well, if I keep going, then maybe Robin Schiff is gonna find a word and put it in a book. I don't know what's gonna happen, but I'm just sure that nobody else is gonna do it, so it may as well be me ruining my eyesight and so forth. Yes? Yeah. The question is, for beginning researchers, archivists, what's the best thing to do and what's the worst thing to do? Do you mean like the most fun thing, or do you mean? To other people? Yeah, well, good luck. I would say the only reason I got to be the person who edited the entire body of Marianne Moore's work with a major trade publisher is that I had spent a good 10 years before that doing very small chunks of her work with a completely obscure publisher. And I did that just because I loved the work. It was what was interesting to me, I couldn't think of any better way to spend my time. And then because I had done these 2 editions, it turned out that the president of FSG, Jonathan Galassi, was also a Marianne Moore freak. I had no idea. And he found my editions, and so eventually I met him, and everything sort of worked out. So I don't know, the best I can tell you is just like, do what seems to you interesting, and when people tell you that it's not, or they don't pay attention to it, just keep doing it anyway. Don't stop. Oh my gosh, okay, Rita. Getting into poetry, yeah, that was a big mistake. Yeah. So the question, which isn't really a question so much as a cry of pain, is if I, like you, am interested in poetry and I am facing today's job market, what on earth should I do? Yeah, I wish I knew the answer to that. But again, I don't know. I just kind of kept doing what I wanted to do. And if you keep doing that, sooner or later people have to pay attention to you. Don't stop, Screw them. Fumi? Oh. Mm. Wait, I'm sorry, Funmi. I gotta summarize your question first because I'm gonna forget it if I wait any longer. Yeah, so the question is there a connection between those canceled magazines that I talked about and the fact that Marianne Moore wasn't a household name the way certainly her male peers were? Yeah, I mean, the answer is there's a direct connection, of course. Moore had to fight and scratch. At least once, one of her major books was put on hold because her publisher decided to bring out 2 young male poets before her. Why? I don't know. Nobody reads them now. But it just made intuitive sense that they weren't going to publish, this single woman until they had given the young men in their house a chance. No, I mean, it's terrible, right? Like, it has always seems to be the case that, like, if you are any kind of identity that gets marked as special or different or whatever, then, you're tolerated kind of as long as people want to tolerate you. And the moment that that's not true anymore, they just say, oh, no, you can just wait or stop or not be a problem or, whatever it is. Sorry. It's my job to depress people tonight. Yes? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, okay. Sure. Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, I've done all this work taking Moore's poetry back to its original forms, but are there no cases where her revisions weren't in fact better? I think sort of lurking beneath that question is a less polite but even more valid question, which is, who the hell do I think I am? If one of the great poets of the American 20th century thinks that she's put her work in the shape it ought to be in, who am I, Heather Caswhite, to come along and tell her different? I guess one thing I'll say in my defense is that I wasn't the only person who thought this. This has been a problem in Moore scholarship for a very, very long time. So if I got to be the one to come in and set things right, it wasn't because I suddenly said, oh my God, there's a problem, and everybody else said, what? We've been fine all this time. It was just because, through various circumstances, I got to be the one to do it. But the more interesting question is, if there are better later versions, why not leave well enough alone? I can't think of any poems that I thought were better after her revisions. But that almost doesn't matter. It really isn't what I think. Like, the job of my edition is to certainly make the choices that I think ought to be made, but also to explain them, like to give readers a theory behind my choices. It's not just, I like this poem and I like this poem and I like this poem. It really is an argument about why it's better for us collectively to know one version of Moore rather than another. So in this case, I would say I went back to the originals in part because you simply can't understand why she was so important to her moment unless you actually read the poems that her peers were reading. If what you're reading, so if you're reading like a 1967 version of a 1932 poem, you can't understand why her peers in 1932 got all excited about it. So in my argument, part of my argument was a historical one about literary history. So anyway, we could talk for a long time about this. But thank you for the question, which is excellent. Yes, Steve Trout. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Right. I have a book coming out next week. If I'd been thinking, I would have put a slide, but I didn't think about it. I edited a volume of the letters of Harold Bloom. Harold Bloom was a literary critic who was, for a literary critic, very famous. He had books on the New York Times bestseller list. He had interviews in places like GQ and The New Yorker and a lot of places. So I edited his letters, and when I edited Moore, what I was trying to do was go back to the original poem as her peers knew it. What I was doing with Bloom was cutting the letters to ribbons in such a way that readers would be interested in them, but his family wouldn't object to anything in them. So, I mean, there's like almost no connection between what editing the poems and editing the letters was about. They were two entirely different actions. And each has, you know, challenges and delights. The delight was that after, you know, beating my head against a wall trying to get 10 million little details accurate in the work of Marianne Moore, with Harold Bloom, I could just go in and change whatever I felt like with respect to punctuation and spelling and typeface and all kinds of things. So that was great. Yes, Emily. My next, well, I guess, so my next book after the next one is an edition of the letters between Marianne Moore and Elizabeth Bishop. Elizabeth Bishop, a similarly great 20th century poet. And editing the letters of Marianne Moore it's different in many ways, because my job in editing Moore's letters is, by the way, not to cut them to ribbons. Like in that, I faithfully record everything she did, but there's so much that people have to understand about context in order to be able to understand the letters. So really a lot of the art there was just deciding what people needed to know, what they might be curious about, what could I actually find. So it was a different kind of research project that way.
I think we need to stop there and continue the conversation at the reception. So thank you very much, Dr. White.
Thank you all so much.
Let's